Well, welcome again, guys, to week 3 of World in the New Testament. I was talking with Bill today. And before I forget, I'm going to mute everyone. And then, so I was talking with Bill today, and just I was saying, I've gotten to see a number of classes John Haberlin's taught, that Joe Bettridge has taught, and that Jim's taught now. But I never am able to go to the Bill Kettenring class because he teaches it right before worship on Sunday mornings, and I usually have a couple of other things going on at that time. So I'm personally really excited about this. And he said, well, okay, that makes me more nervous. But I say there's no reason to be nervous, because all the glowing reviews that come out of his class are from so many different people. I think it was Pat Bachman who said this is not Bill, this is not an old person joke, but Pat Bachman, I think, said, you'd think Bill lived in these times. The way he talks about it, it's like they're his friends. He knows the world so well, the world in the New Testament. So just great at making the world come alive, and I'm excited. I can't, I guess, because I haven't seen him teach, technically commend him as a teacher, but many of you know Bill Kettenring. I can certainly commend him as a person, because he's just a great human being, and I so appreciate Bill and just his wisdom and compassion and the insight he brings. So he's going to take us through this wild house of Herod tonight. I'll turn it over to you now, Bill.
Thank you. Nothing like setting the bar high. Get all the expectations up. I do want to say thank you to you, Pastor, and to Pastor Jim for setting the bar high. The last 2 lessons have been magnificent. I really enjoyed it. Sometimes I think that American Christians leave the Sunday school to the children, and then they think of Sunday school, or they think of adult education as just like bigger Bible study, or something like the to-do list that you might have got at 3rd grade, or the Bible stories lesson that you might have got when you were in kindergarten or something like that. And there's so much more to Christian history and theology, so much wisdom that we could be practicing in the church. And as a time like this, that needs to be practiced and needs to be offered to the world. So both of you, Pastor Jim and Pastor Tyler, I appreciate this opportunity, not for my sake, but for us as a congregation, that I think that we can actually give some insight and behave like the oil and like the Spirit would lead us to bring peace to the world that Jesus gives us. So I'm going to do this. I'll tell you up front, I got to, if I can have a little bit more time, personal privilege. It's well, let's see if I can do it in another way. I want to say thank you to each of you who are the familiar faces on here, and the ways that you have buoyed me up in the past. I appreciate being able to see you again. And for those of you who are new to me, I'm wanting to say some things about Bible study that we probably, for people who have been to my classes before, have heard this before, so you can sign off if you want to. But I think that needs to be said. Kind of put the concepts in the frontal lobe, and help us to understand that when we're going to talk about the Herods, they are actually our brothers and sisters. They are human like we are, and we are not better than they. And it's really easy to get into the gossipy parts about the ain't it awful what they did and what they're like. But it's very important for us to understand that the reason why they are in the Gospels The reason why the gospel writers and the reason why they are used is because they were in the air. When the Gospels were being written, everybody knew the gospel gossip that was coming out of the Herodian court. Everybody knew what was the latest outrage that happened. And just like in our own day, where it feels a little good to listen to the scandal that's over there instead of paying any attention to what's happening in our own life. And that's a trap. When we begin to look at the other people like they're somehow less than we are, or somehow they're more profane than we are, the reason why the gospel writers used the Herods and used Herod to describe what was happening was because it was on everybody's mind, and because it becomes an amazing object lesson for us to see the difference between the way things are done in the Herodian court and the way things are done when Jesus is in charge. Does that make sense? So I'd like you to think about that, have that in the front of your head when we go through the lessons. I have to go through the conversation about Herod's because it's not clear, especially if we were the sort of people who only went to church on Easter and Christmas. Herod is Herod. And it's kind of interesting that he tried to kill the babies in Bethlehem, and then he tried to kill Jesus. And okay, then you go on with your life. You don't think twice about Herod. But actually, they were 4 or 5 men, depending on how you call them, who lived about a range of 100 years. And they had an unusual influence on the way that the New Testament world thought of itself, and the way the gospel writers thought of their job in bringing the gospel to the world. So that's a little bit of what I want to do with you today, is go through real fast some of the stories of each of these men and their families, and then talk a little bit about the power dynamic that was also happening in other parts of Palestine. Does that make sense? Not if you're on the same page more or less with me. Okay. First, the first person that's in the Herod story is not actually a Herod. He's the father of Herod. And he's important to mention because the overriding, when we talk about Herod the Great, the overriding image that we have of Herod the Great is that he was despised by the Jews. Nobody liked him. Nobody liked him. And the reason why they didn't like him began with the fact that he was the son of Antipater of Idumea, meaning that he wasn't actually a Jew. He was an Edomite. And if you know your Old Testament history, an Edomite, and Edom is another name for Esau. Esau was the brother of Jacob who became Israel. Does that make sense? The two brothers, born of Rachel, born of Rebekah, the two brothers that did not like each other, separated in not happy terms. And according to the Old Testament, they didn't like each other very much. During the reigns of Solomon and David, the Edomites were used as slave labor in the Solomonic mines, and that metalworking was one of the reasons why ancient Israel was so wealthy. And so when Israel was taken, or when Judah was taken into exile to Babylon, the Edomites, the scripture says, actually stood outside Jerusalem heckling the people who had their hair being shaved and their clothes being ripped off and being put into chains by the Babylonians. The Edomites stood around being part of the group that was attacking them and laughing at them and spitting on them and making fun of them. And when the Jews came back from Babylon, when they came back to Jerusalem, they found people were living in their old ancestral homes. Who were the people living in the ancestral homes? Some of them were Edomites. So the Jews, as they were establishing their new country, as they were trying to bring back the world to the way it was at the time of David and Solomon, found themselves often opposed and disliking and in conflict with the Edomites who were nearby, living in the area. So Herod was an Edomite, according to the way that the Jews thought of things. Jews thought of themselves as a group of people who were descended from Judah. Edomites could care less about that. During the time of the Hasmonean kingdom, after the Maccabees pushed the Greeks out of Palestine, and they established their 100-year kingship. During that time, some of the Hasmonean kings decided that what they needed to do was they needed to force the Edomites to become Jews. And so many of the Edomites were converted to Judaism. Technically speaking, Antipater, the Idumean, was a Jew, except that as biases linger and suspicions continue, they didn't like each other, even though they were now both inside Judaism. So I said that Herod was despised. It started out because he didn't have the right lineage. Herod began life as we know it, as we hear about him, as the Roman governor of the province of Galilee. And his job was to collect the taxes for Rome and to make sure that civil order didn't get out of hand. And so when he was governor, there was this incident where he chased the bandits that had been a bit of a problem for the people, chased them all over until he found them, and then he killed them. Was another thing that he didn't have the right to do, a reason why he was despised. This was such a heinous story to have heard, that the Sanhedrin, the first time that Herod ever had anything to do with the Sanhedrin nearly deposed him, and he carried a lifelong grudge against the Sanhedrin because of the way that they treated him. They nearly deposed him. And years to come later, he killed half of them. So that's another reason why he was despised. Herod was despised because he had a tumultuous life, family life. When the curtain is open and he begins to show up, he is married to Doris, and his oldest son is. I'm going to see if I can connect this properly. I had problems earlier. When Herod comes on the scene, his oldest son, Antipater, born of Doris, were his family. But as he became more powerful, as he was able to obtain from Rome the right to be called the King of the Jews, he decided that he needed to work a little bit harder on getting some legitimacy. And so he married Mariam. The way we mostly talk about Mariamne is through the Greek line, but it actually in Aramaic is Miriam. He married this Miriam, who was the granddaughter of the last king and the granddaughter of the last of the last Hasmonean high priest. She despised him because he had killed them, but she bore him two sons, And over the children's lifetime, until about 3 years before Herod died, it became more and more clear that Mariamne was not. She just didn't like him, and he became more and more suspicious that she was out to get him. And there's evidence that she did try to hurt him, and he was so suspicious that he killed her or had her killed, and he killed both Aristobulus and Herod II, because he was afraid that these two were going to take over his um, kingship and take the kingship away from him. He was paranoid, and he had reasons to be paranoid because they really did hate him. But he also had reasons to hate him because Antipater, his oldest son, was always trying to get them in trouble, and so was seeding lots of accusations against that part of the family. So the first three children here, by uh, by 4, that should be BCE. By 4 BCE, these three children were killed by Herod. Augustus said that it would be better for Herod to have. It would be safer for Herod to have a pig. It would be safer for Herod's pig than it to be Herod's sons. Herod died in 4 BCE, and this is a adult Christian education class, so Christians need to be paying attention to that. It's hard when you're not able to give me feedback. Do you catch that 4 before the Common Era is 4 BC, is 4 years before the first year, and the Western calendar is supposed to be based on Jesus' birth in 0 BCE. So there's a little discrepancy that good adult Christian education students might be interested in talking about. Anyway, I'll try to move along a little bit faster. Over here is Archelaus, who became the tetrarch of Judea after Herod died. By the time that Herod died, he was so afraid that he was going to be killed or deposed that he made it clear that no one who, if he was killed, that no one would inherit the entire kingship of Judea. This territory all along here is all of the area that Herod was in charge of. But in his will, he made it clear that his 4 remaining sons would be assigned only 1/4 of his kingdom each, so that there would be no reason for them to kill him. So Archelaus got this part in here, the Judea part, the Samaria part, Idumea. His son Agrippa got the Galilee part. Philip got the part over here in Gaulonitis. And
hey, really quick, Bill.
Yes.
Your slides are not showing.
Oh dear. Well,
Are you pulling up the Tetrarchy right now?
Yes, I am.
All right, let me see if I can.
So all that stuff I was trying to show you about the family lineage of the dynasty didn't work, huh?
No, here, and I can pull that up too. Let me pull up the map, because I saw what you had earlier. Do we have it now? Let's see. You guys see that map?
Okay. I cannot see yours. I'm going to escape. Okay, I see something.
Do you see the map?
I see a map.
Is that the one you wanted?
Yeah, that is the map I wanted.
Okay, great.
Okay, so just for clarification, did anybody see any of the slides that showed the family lineage? No, 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 no. You guys were so polite, kept your well behaved. It's that Presbyterian thing, I can tell. Well, I will connect that. Yeah, there's one that'll work a little bit. That one isn't accurate. Well, let me talk about the map while it's in front of you. So can you see how the map is in blue and orange and there's a little purple section, and how the map seems to be spread? It's kind of like the way modern Israel is now, where you you have whole plots of land that are not connected to each other. That was done on purpose to make it a little bit more difficult uh, to create an army and to create a safe place for somebody to create a plot against Herod. He deliberately tried to do that, tried to make anybody who would succeed him or anybody who wanted to oppose him would never be strong enough to actually depose him. Make sense? Okay, that one that you just showed just a second ago, this one right there, I can't see it very well, but it does give you a good idea of some of the stuff that's on there in their life. Okay, so let me move on a little bit with the dynasty, and I'll try to use word pictures so that you can get the idea. There was a recurring problem in the Herodian dynasty is they never felt legitimate. The Hebrews didn't want the Jews didn't want him around. The Jews didn't trust him. They always knew that he was a client king. His route to power was that he held the purse strings. He was the one in charge of collecting the taxes, and he was able to live very large off of the taxes that he was able to collect. But his people under him, besides being weighted down by the taxes, realized that he would always do what Rome wanted him to do. So they didn't trust him, and he didn't trust them. The people that succeeded him were his 4 sons, and their kingships were specifically created so that they would never be strong enough to ever create another Herod-like person. And Rome liked it that way. There was a clause in his will that if one of the 4 brothers preceded any of the others in death, then their territory would be given back to Rome. So that's one of the reasons why you have Pontius Pilate in charge of Judea by the time of Jesus's trial. So let me. I have to consult the. Following Herod the First, with the 4 different sons of Herod. The Herod that shows up in the Bible, the Herod that goes after John the Baptist, and the Herod who's standing at Jesus' trial, Pontius Pilate refers to him, is Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas. And he is in some ways far worse than his dad. If you remember your story about how John the Baptist was critical of Herod because he had married his half-brother's wife. The reason why Herod wanted his half-brother's wife was because his half-brother's wife was the daughter of an heir to the original Hasmonean kingdom. So first Herod wants to become a king. He's not good enough for the Jews, so he decides that he's going to marry Marianne, or Miriam, depending on how you pronounce her name. He wants to marry Miriam because she's the daughter of the king of Judea. And at least his children will be legitimate. But then, of course, he killed them, right? He killed the two boys that might have replaced him as king of Judea. And Herodias was the daughter of one of those two boys. And so when Herod Antipas comes to power, he also wants the legitimacy because he's not getting legitimacy from his dad. His mother was a Samaritan. So he decides that he's going to marry one of Mariamne's children. And he tries to, so he steals Herodias from his half-brother. And John the Baptist says, no, that is immoral. You should not have done that. That is the wrong thing to do, which ends up John the Baptist is put into jail. Now I've totally lost anything.
I'm putting up the family tree for you.
Oh, okay. All right. Can you see how Herod Agrippa and Herodias are related to each other right here? Okay. So Herod Agrippa marries Herodias. Herodias used to, I'm sorry, I have no way to point to it. Nod your heads if you can see the Herod Agrippa and the Herodias line. Okay, thank you. Herodias was married at one time to Philip, who is the person on the far right. And this is his key to becoming a legitimate king. And his hope is that by marrying her, that he will be legitimate and his children will be legitimate in the eyes of the Jewish people. But as it was, Herod Agrippa II down here betrays his uncle. There's a change in emperors. Tiberius dies. Caligula wants to become emperor, and Herod Agrippa II had grown up. I'm sorry, Herod Agrippa had grown up with some of the emperor's Tiberius's children. Does this feel like Game of Thrones now that I'm telling you this with all of these different stories of different people? Let me cut to the chase. It's a very dysfunctional family, and they were the scandal of the day, and they were constantly in fusses with and intrigue and betraying each other and trying to run off to Rome and get special privileges and do emissaries so that they could get in the good graces of the current emperor, or they could betray someone to another, betray one emperor over the other. And this Herod dynasty began their influence with Rome at the time of Julius Caesar, and it went all the way through to the times of Titus. So this dynasty was powerful because they had very powerful people in high places, but they never paid any attention to the real needs of the people around them. They lived in high style. Herod Agrippa the second was known for getting into lots and lots of trouble financially, even though he had the entire tax system at his income level. He was always spending more money than he had. Herod the Great, to go back a little bit, Herod the Great is the person who is responsible for building the temple. The 46 years it took to build that temple is because Herod the Great. Herod the Great also built 4 other temples, not Jewish ones. He built uh, uh, um, amphitheaters, he built roads, he built palaces, he built fortresses, he built palace fortresses, he built a harbor established at a city that he created and named after uh, August, Augustus, Caesar Augustus, called Caesarea Maritima. He spent a lot of money. Um, he wasn't called Herod the Great at the time that he was living. It took almost 15 centuries before people would begin to call him Herod the Great. And that was mostly because they admired the work that he had done. They did not like him. Um, Herod Antipas is the Herod that killed John the Baptist. Herod Antipas is the man that stood in judgment of Jesus. Herod Agrippa, that's the third line. Herod Agrippa is the Herod that killed James, the brother of John. Herod Agrippa was known for being a good Jew. The Jews to this day appreciate him over or think of him highly in ways that Christians always make Herod the bad guy. The Jews don't think of him that so bad. And one of the reasons why is because after 34 BC, the country of Israel was becoming more and more nationalistic. They were becoming more and more resentful of Rome. And in order to retain power, the political class in Israel became more and more adamant that, the reason why we're having these difficulties is because of the Romans and all those other people. That idea, that stuff that was in the air, that resentment that people had of the Romans was stoked by the elites of Israel, of Judah, and the country was becoming more and more nationalistic. Herod Agrippa discovered that by being more pious, being more Jewish than everybody had been previously, that the Jews began to like him. And I need to put in a little apology here. When I talk about the Jews, that phrase is loaded, and I admit that it's loaded, and I am not using it like that. I want to make it really clear. The Bible talks about the Jews as people who live down there in Jerusalem. The gospel writers, in a lot of ways, have their perspective about the way things ought to be, as we are Israelites. We are people who are descendants of Israel. And the people who lived in Galilee, many of them, they probably couldn't do a very good job of it because all the documentation was gone. But when Israel was taken off into oblivion by the Assyrians, we often tell the story like there are no 10 tribes left. Actually, most of them left, or at least the wealthy and the well-educated left, gone forever. But many people still living in the land were somehow related to some of those tribes. So when the Jews came back from exile years later, they found the people living in the land. Some of them thought of themselves as Israelites, and they weren't all that happy about being called Jews, or the Jews coming back home from Babylon and beginning to tell everybody how to do Judaism or how to be worshipers of Yahweh. Or it's kind of like that cousin who moves back home and says, you're doing it wrong. So Herod Agrippa discovered that as the people were becoming more and more resentful of Rome, that he could actually consolidate his power by banking on that and becoming more nationalistic, and he began to practice more and more Judaism, or more and more of the Jewish law, and to uh, do what he could to please the religious fervor that was beginning to grow in that part of the country, in that part of the world. And it was becoming upsetting to Rome, but it didn't matter as long as they could talk about this in um, in Palestine like that. So one of the things that Herod Agrippa did was to kill, um, was to begin persecuting the Christian church, this little tiny church, and they killed James. And Herod discovered that the Jews really liked that. The people living in Jerusalem, the religious folk, the folk who wanted to tell everybody about how to live as Jews. And so Herod banked on that and began stoking the kinds of resentment that ended up in a rebellion against Rome, and actually was one of the, with the idea that if we could just throw off the Romans, then in throwing off the Romans, we could reestablish the Hasmonean kingdom and maybe find somebody who is a descendant of David and reestablish the kingship as God intended. That's what their hope was. But what they really did was foment rebellion and brought the ire of Rome down upon them. In 66, they started a rebellion, and they brought the Roman legions to Palestine. Rome saying, we'll have none of that. And Rome burned down the temple in 70 AD. Herod Agrippa II, that's that last line, is the Herod that stood in judgment of Paul when he came back to Jerusalem and discovered the hyper-nationalism that they were experiencing. So much so that even bringing a Gentile near the courts created a riot. And that was the actual offense that Paul was captured on and indicted for and sent to Caesarea Philippi for. Okay, your ears pinned back? Or you thinking, okay, this has been too long? I need to talk a little bit about the Sanhedrin. That Sanhedrin, that group of people, that group of legislators, judges, we don't have a corollary to what the Sanhedrin was. It was, depending on the size of the city, it was a group of 23 people or a group of 70 people. There was the Greater Sanhedrin, which came out of Jerusalem. Had 70 people, and they stood in judgment not only of the civil law or scandals or disputes that were happening among the ordinary people. You realize the king was all about collecting the taxes and making sure that there was civil order, but the Sanhedrin was the group of people that told you this is how we do it. They took care of arguments between businesses or between customers and businesses, or how neighborhoods should be laid out and that kind of a thing. They were the people who decided problems or in the broader scope of things, what was appropriate where, or what was appropriate behavior, what to do with somebody who wasn't moral or who was not practicing the religion appropriately. So we don't have a group like that. They were legislative, like our Congress. They were judicial, like our Supreme Court, and they were a mixed bag. They first developed. It was an old structure, an old institution, older than any of the kingships. So even David and Solomon had difficulties with the Sanhedrins, the groups of elders who sat outside the gates of the city, and created judgments and told them what to do and what not to do. There are stories in the Old Testament of the fusses that particularly Solomon and Rehoboam had with the Sanhedrin. When Ezra came back from Babylon, he reestablished the Sanhedrin. And so when the Sanhedrin bumped into little Herod, they thought they had the right to tell him what to do. During Herod the Great's reign, he had vengeance on them. At an opportunity, he managed to have 35 of them killed all in one day, or all in 1 week. So all of that is behind the Gospels. Every time they're mentioned, this story is stinking in the room. And when you hear the stories about how Jesus was confronted by the scribes and the Pharisees, they're actually talking about the Sanhedrin, or the people who were loyal to the Sanhedrin. And at the trial, when Pontius Pilate becomes friends for the first time with Herod Agrippa, the gospel writers are telling us something about the kind of power structure that the early church had to endure, the kind of power that the early church decided was not the kind of power that Jesus asked us to follow. So with that, I think I've done enough damage, I hope. I want to ask some questions. I had an old preacher tell me once when I was a young man, the shepherd leads his sheep, the devil drives his cattle. So I don't want to teach a lesson out of this and then tell you this is what you ought to do. I would like to ask you questions for you to consider. What do you, when you know this stuff behind the scenes, why would the gospel writers tell you that? Why does Jesus, when he's describing Herod, call him that vixen? But the gospel writers talk about how this way of doing government, or this way of doing business, was not Jesus' way. What does that mean to us today? Tyler, do you want to turn people's things on in case people have questions or they want to?
Yeah, let me unmute. We'll see how this goes. All right. Do you want to say that question again, Bill?
Do you have questions? Do you have comments? The question I have is, now that you've heard this backstory, why do you think the gospel writers wrote about Herod or the Sanhedrin?
Bill. Hello, Bill. Hello, Bill.
There you are.
Yeah, hello, Bill.
Yes.
Yeah, Denny Smith here. The Sanhedrin was made up of both Sadducees and Pharisees. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I didn't put this in because I think, Tyler, you're going to talk about Sadducees and Pharisees.
Yeah.
Sadducees were the traditionalists. We often get it backwards in the way we understand Sunday school. The Sadducees were the traditionalists, the people who did the worship in the temple like they'd always done it, or at least the way that the people coming back from the exile said that they always did it. They were the elites. They were the well-trained. That's why they're called scribes. They were the people who tended to be wealthy or had a vested interest in being part of the establishment. The Pharisees, on the other hand, were more of an innovation. They were people who brought back some of the ideas that they found in Babylon and applied them to Judaism. So the whole concept of, for instance, the resurrection was an innovation that the Pharisees brought back and used to explain why there wasn't justice in the world now. Justice would come someday in the resurrection. And they didn't like each other. They didn't get along very well, partially because they wanted to have control of people's of the ideology. I'm wondering if the difference between I don't know, political parties today are kind of like that. Tyler, you're going to be the expert. I'll defer to you next week or 2 weeks from now.
So, Bill, to answer your question about why did Jesus talk about Herod or the system the way it was, would it be along the line that the king wasn't there for the king? He was there to help lead the people. He was supposed to be looking after the welfare of the people. It's just what, we look to God to do for us. Is that kind of where you're going?
I think, here, take off my teaching hat and put on my Bill Kettenring hat. I do think that there is that the gospel writers are saying, we don't want to do it like Herod. We don't want to do power like Herod.
Right.
We want to do power like Jesus. And there is a tendency to say, I need power, so I will take power wherever I can find it, and I will give power any way I can. I will take power and I will give power as it's convenient. There is a way that the scriptures, that we as human beings do that with power. And so we're willing to make compromises with the political class as long as it gives us a little power, and we don't want to give compromises to the political class or anybody else as long as it takes power away from us. And the gospel writers were saying that's a trap. Jesus did it entirely differently. He didn't do it like now that's Bill's opinion. I want to hear your opinion, what you're thinking when you see the way the gospel writers include the Herods.
Yeah, Sandy and Jim.
I think we have such little understanding of the political situation then, because we just get these little glimpses thrown in here and there in the gospel. But I think you come to realize that operating outside of that isn't possible. So it certainly impacts everything that happens. So, getting this kind of background is very, very worthwhile. And they couldn't write the story, frankly, without including, those references. But we don't have much of an understanding of what that's really about. So thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Sandy.
Bill, if I may ask or respond, it seems to me that the gospel writers were writing of conditions of their day that everybody knew about, and that was the creation of, or the source of all of their misery. And when Jesus came along, it was an entirely different kingdom, and it took the apostles until his death to figure out what kind of a kingdom he was talking about. So to talk about Herod's kingdom or the Romans' influence as compared to Jesus was a night and day difference of where they were headed.
Yes. One thing that Tyler said last week that I thought was just magnificent. He mentioned the 7 times 70 or 7 times 7. Was this in your sermon or was this last week in your class? I can't remember.
You mean the Daniel thing?
The Daniel.
Yeah, that was last week's class. Yeah.
Talking about things that are in the air. The the politics of Palestine, particularly among the Pharisees, but among other groups as well, was how do we get these Romans to be gone, and how do we get the prophecy of Daniel to come true? And the way that they looked at the world was that this Daniel thing was difficult, and so they would be reading a lot of Daniel. They would be reading a lot of Isaiah. They would be reading a lot of these books that would give them insight of how to behave so that they could throw off the Romans, and they wouldn't have this stupid class of people who were persecuting them and taxing them and all those other things that were happening. And so the idea that you came back from Babylon, but exile is still not finished. That no, it's not 70 years, but it's 7 times 70. Does that make sense? That Daniel idea of 490 years is in the air. And so when someone comes up along and says to Jesus, I have this guy, he bothers me, and I want to forgive him. I've forgiven him 7 times already. I need to forgive him how many times? And Jesus says 7 times 70. Does that make sense? He's not just saying, well, you kind of have to overlook the difficulties that your coworkers create for you or somebody that you live with, but you have to forgive 490 years of destitution and cruelty and oppression. That'll make your socks roll up and down.
It seems like, I have a question.
Okay.
I was under the impression that the how do you pronounce it? Sanhedrin?
Yeah.
That they were probably afraid of Jesus, but maybe also a little jealous of him.
I didn't hear the word that you were talking about, the Sadducees. Is that what you were trying to say?
The Sanhedrin.
Oh, the Sanhedrin. Okay.
That they were jealous of Jesus and maybe even a little afraid of him.
I think that they were afraid. I think that, I've noticed this with the grandchildren. If I tell them what to do and they hop to, I like that. If I tell them what to do and they just kind of peel off like big family syndrome and don't do as I tell them, or they don't seem to care what I tell them to do, I don't like that so much. And that's the Sanhedrin's problem, is they liked it. They liked, Jesus mentioned they liked to stand at the corners and have everybody bow to them and nod and say hello and how are you doing, Mr. Whatever. But when you say, when the people didn't care about the power structure, they didn't care about the status, they didn't care about the rank, that could get a little irksome for the Sanhedrin.
It's interesting to me. I don't know if I'm on,
Yep.
but the writers of the Gospels, after, they had time for this to sink in before they, and they would have been, early on thinking that it was going to be another kingdom, like Herod, like Rome, like, the Messiah, all that same type of power. And after sitting around and thinking about it for a while, it seems like then when they wrote, they could have been trying to make that point that it's a different kind of power. The first shall be last, and the least are the greatest, and all that kind of stuff. That it really is, the juxtaposition of the power, which is what they all thought when they saw when they, on Palm Sunday, when they're laying down their palms and thinking, Hosanna to the, the Messiah and all. But they were, it's like the gospel writers had time to absorb that. And then when they just, wrote the Gospels, they laid that out a little bit more. I never thought of it. I find it really interesting.
That's very insightful. If you realize that the Gospels are being written around 50, 60,
yes, they had time
right at that time when the nationalism has this, what do I want to say? Nationalism is not a good word, but they were centered on their own ethnic needs and their desire to have their own nation. There's what I mean by nationalism. And so when the Gospels are being written, it's in the middle of this anxiety that everybody's having about the increasing frustration under the Romans. And there are, like, for instance, John, the Gospel of John is written clearly after the temple is destroyed. And so you hear the stories just look into the difference. I mean, read the Gospels again.
Yeah.
When you begin to realize that there was this arc of mild irritation under Herod, but look, we got the pretty buildings, to this place where they resent Rome, but they are clearly a Roman province, to this place where they will murder somebody because they approach the temple, to this what Palestine was like after the destruction of the temple. And on the last session we're going to be talking about Christianity was built out of that struggle between the Pharisees and Christians, who were the only legitimate, or what do I want to say? If you can think that the whole point of the Pharisees' comment is, let's be holy enough that Messiah will come. Let's get everybody to be holy. Let's get everybody to get on the same team, and we'll get good enough, and then Messiah will come and wipe out the Romans for us. Sadducees were not invested in that story. They lost all credibility when the temple was destroyed. So the only people who had a story to tell after the temple was destroyed were the Pharisees. See, I told you so. And the Christians, who said, that's not how we do power.
One more thing, Bill. I'm still not totally clear. Hasmonean. What does that really refer to?
Okay, Hasmonean. The first Maccabee, I guess his name was Hasmos or Hashmosh or something like that. I don't remember very well. But when he got during the time that the Greek Seleucids had control over Palestine, they did some awful things, including putting statues of themselves up into the temple or sacrificing a pig on the altar. They were doing these non-kosher things. And the Maccabees were a family that opposed and surprised everybody by creating a guerrilla war, a guerrilla band that was able to throw out the Greeks. It was unheard of that they were able to create this rebellion to throw off the Greeks, the most powerful army in the world. And they established a kingship or a kingdom, and they set themselves up as kings and high priests. Yeah. But by the time Herod came along, by the time Herod's father Antipater of Idumea came along, they were squabbling with each other all the time. They were arguing with each other, fussing, and no, I want to be the king. No, I want to be the high priest. No, you can be it next year. That kind of a thing. It was that family of kings, as they, the last king died, so they're trying to figure out who's going to be in charge. Each one independently. I think that John Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, I'm not sure if I've got the names correct, but the two men independently went to the Roman general Pompey, and said, would you help me if you help me become king? And Pompey said to both of them, sure, I'll just be right over. And that's how Rome came to Jerusalem. So this kingship, this kingdom lasted for about 100 years. All the way through the Herods, there were still descendants of those kings. So Princess Miriam, Princess Miriam marries Herod the Great. Princess Herodias marries Herod Agrippa. Princess Salome marries Philip. So the Herods added to their legitimacy. Rome gave them the kingship, but their legitimacy came because they were married to the Hasmonean descendant.
Thank you.
Were the Maccabees?
Started with the Maccabees.
I heard something about Maccabees.
I have a question.
Pat Bachman.
I heard.
Who wanted?
Bill, that was me, and I said the
Trying to
Hasmoneans
find you. Who's talking?
Hasmonean basically refers to Maccabees. Is that what you're
Yes,
saying?
yes. The father of the Maccabees, I believe, is Hash. The name escapes me, but basically it's his name. It's kind of like Charlemagne. Is Charles the Great. His father was Pepin. So sometimes when people talk about Charlemagne's dynasty, it's the Pepin dynasty. It's one of the reasons why I used the story of Antipater of Idumea, because even though Herod the Great is Herod the Great, he couldn't be who he was except for his father was in the right position to give him power. So it is with the Maccabees. Their family name was Hasmonean.
Thank you.
Which Herod built Masada?
Herod the Great.
Great. So he was doing all the building, and then Masada, he was the paranoid guy.
Yes, he was paranoid. He not only Masada, but he built Herodian. He rebuilt the fortifications around Jerusalem. He was paranoid. To say he was paranoid he was so paranoid that I told you that he changed his will so that his 4 sons could only get a part of his kingdom in case he died. He was also so paranoid that he left commands so that when he died, all the pretty people would be killed too. That didn't happen, but that was his order on his deathbed.
Which, yeah, I think that's another kind of point that might illustrate sort of how things were in the air. I've heard that, like the verse when Jesus talks about faith that can move mountains.
Yes.
Herod moved a mountain to build Masada. I mean, the engineering of that literally, was the restructuring of a mountain. So it's another one of those things that, there's certain phrases we say culturally that immediately trigger stuff for us, and that may very well be, just another example of this. This is in the air. People would have known, what that might be in reference to.
Yeah. Question. Bill.
Yes.
What were you getting on about at the start of this? That Herod died 4 years before Jesus was born?
That's one of those things that's really ticklish. Theoretically, 0 AD is in the year of our Lord, and it's the date of his birth, right? Theoretically. And then as people work things out through church history, the year of our Lord the year of our Lord is pretty stable, but the actual day that Jesus was born kind of wanders back and forth across that divide, sometimes a little bit before 0 AD and a little bit after 0 AD. But if I say that Herod died in 4 BC, that means 4 before Christ. That means 4 years before Jesus was born. Yes?
Yes.
So how could he murder the Bethlehem babies 4 years after he died? How could the Magi visit him 4 years? So do you see, that's the adult education question. There are some folk who will explain it all away because they need to fit their predetermined ideas of what Christianity is into. They need to fit the Bible into their predetermined ideas about what Christianity is. But if you are looking at the evidence that the Bible gives, you have a bit of a struggle.
So is it really like 4 to 6 BC that he was born?
Yes, it's wiggly because it's kind of hard to tell precisely. Well, one of the things I've mentioned this in men's breakfast is that the ancient calendar had 10 days, 10 months in it, and the 2 other months were kind of iffish. They happened during the winter, and nobody really knew when they were. And that's why if you've noticed that they inserted July for Julius and August, Augustus. And made September, which means 7th month, they made that the 9th month. And October, which means, anyone? 8? Turns it into the 10th month. And November, which means?
9.
10.
Okay, you got the picture. So the ancient calendar didn't really concern itself that much with months and precisely when they were and how they fit into. It's all relative, like Tiberius. There's one place where it describes something that happened. One of the gospel writers says the 14th year of Tiberius, when Quirinius was king, when Quirinius was governor, except that Quirinius was not governor when Tiberius was emperor, or he was, but not in the 14th year. So it's a little goosey, and Christians adult Christians who are faithful to the scriptures need to struggle with that a little bit.
But not a lot.
Yeah, it doesn't end up destroying your faith. That doesn't, in the end, does that matter?
Because the New Testament doesn't say BC or AD. It says this happened before Herod died. And
absolutely.
It's kind of like we have a Chinese New Year, and we have American New Year, and we have Orthodox Easter, and we have Roman Catholic and Protestant Easter, and our calendars are not entirely synced either.
Yeah.
But imagine that kind of dissync, like Bill was talking about. Imagine it in that time frame where months weren't exactly the same all the time. And you've got all these competing ethnic, from different geographic places, ethnic calendars trying to come together. And then we're trying to create one system out of that, BC and AD. So it's kind of like that. But it's confusing, but the Bible isn't confused about how things happen relative to how events happen relative to other events. And that's where we get our specificity from. So don't get hung up on BC or AD. Stay with the sequence of events that you find in the scripture. You won't go wrong.
But we don't ignore it either. One of the weaknesses, I think, in current the world, the popular idea of Christianity is that we think we've got it all sewed up. And actually, I want to model as a Christian. I want to model that I can live with a little ambiguity. I'm not that worried about certain things, but I'm not going to deny that there is this ambiguity, and that's an adult Christian education goal.
Right. So other historical events that gather around that time, figuring out whether they're BC or AD, struggle with the same sort of ambiguity. It's not peculiarly Christian phenomena.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Bill. And as always, you can email in more questions, but we'll next week Jim is up with some of the those intertestamental books and the letter, and some of them aren't actually intertestamental. Some of them are emerging around the same time as the Gospels and are being written in the time of Jesus. But lots of stuff out there, lots of strange stories that emerge, and hopefully, by doing it in week 4, you've got a little bit of sense of some of the context of what's going around, that now seeing the literature that's emerging in that context will make a little more sense, but I know Jim will help us see that too. But yeah, those intertestamental books go this week and try reading the book of Tobit or something, for example. There's just
That's your homework, huh?
I guess Jim should give the homework, though. I mean, truly, and facetiously, I said a few weeks ago, go read the whole Old Testament, but you could absolutely read the book of Tobit in a week, no problem. Or Bell and the Dragon. There's or Jim, you're preparing, so you might have a better sense of if there's one that would set up for next week. But if you've never read an intertestamental book, it's interesting to
They're interesting.
Yeah, how they're thinking.
This is a whole lot of literature that most Christians never read and don't even know about. And there are thousands of pieces of literature, Jewish and Greco-Roman literature, that form a real large part of the cultural background, in the same way that the Herodian dynasty gives you the political background, in the same way that Tyler gave you the historical background. We're just all building up the complexity to the degree that we can from our standpoint in the 21st century, looking back, using all the sources we can find. We're just trying to build up the context, the background against which the New Testament can best be read and understood.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, go read a book of the Apocrypha, or grab the Pseudepigrapha, or I tell you what, do this. Everybody get out your pen and pencil. Now you really got me in professor mode, Tyler. Get out your pen and pencil and write down this web address. Okay. This is your internet homework for the week. Only one website address I'm going to give you. Okay, so they all start www, right? Then you put your dot, and then I want you to put these 3 words together as one word: early Jewish writings. All one word, no spaces. Early Jewish writings, and then put .com. Pull that up in your computer before next week, and just take a look at all the stuff that's there. And if you want to read any of it, click on any of the titles that you find there, and it will open up an open online source for you. It might not be the most recent translation or the best translation, but you'll get an English translation of that source and a little bit about it. And that webpage will give you an idea of just how much literature is out there, and that's just part of it. So we're going to have fun next week.
All right.
All right.
Okay.
Cool. Good to see everyone.
Thank you, Bill. Kettenring.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.
Yeah.